Welcome back, everyone. It's 8:08 on the WGAN Morning News with Ken and Matt. We have a full studio now because we have 3 U.S. Senate candidates with us here for our U.S. Senate Forum to give you all the information you need to vote, apparently. So we'd like to welcome into the studio, to my left, Zach Ringelstein, who is the Democratic candidate for this office. Next to him is Eric Brakey, the Republican. And then to my right is Senator Angus King, who is currently occupying the seat we are referring to. And gentlemen, welcome. Great to have you here in studio.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.
Glad to be here.
So we're going to have each person do a brief 1-minute opening. We're going to have them do, at the end, a brief 1-minute close. We had a lottery to pick who goes first, so we were neutral and fair.
Indeed. Well, as neutral and fair as we can be.
And then we'll, when we start asking the questions, we'll do it in rotation. We'll start with a new person each time and kind of go around. So we'll start with you, Mr. Ringelstein. You have the first opening statement.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for being here, Angus and Eric. I want to start by saying that we live in a crisis. We don't have time for people who take special interest money. We don't have time. Our planet, if you looked at the UN report recently, shows that my children, the kids in my school where I taught, are not going to have a planet that is safe, that is secure, and that is healthy if we continue with gas pipelines, if we continue with the oil and gas industries buying off our politicians. We don't have time as our neighbors are dying, are suffering from healthcare concerns in the richest country on earth where we are not taking care of our own citizens. We don't have time. In 6 more years, 2024, as much as I like Angus King, I am not okay with the fact that he is taking, sir, that you are taking money from ExxonMobil. We don't have time. We live in a rigged system. I'm the only person in this race who's not taking corporate PAC, lobbyists, or fossil fuel money. That means I can stand up for Medicare for all. That means that I can actually work towards a fully renewable energy system quickly. And it means that I can work on our public education system, infrastructure, on all the things that we can have if we're not influenced by big money in politics. I'm excited to debate with you fellas today, and I hope that together as a country we unified can take it back for the people, for the working people of Maine.
Senator.
Well, I decided to run again after realizing that we're still facing some really serious challenges and some great opportunities. The challenges, the opioid epidemic that's ravaging our state, families, individuals, communities, the veterans that we have who aren't getting what they need even though it's what they've earned, concerns about health care across the state, particularly among seniors about the future of Medicare, and some real deep problems in the rural economy based upon the loss of some of our traditional jobs, closing of paper mills over the last several years. Those are the challenges. The good news is that there are some things positive on the horizon. We just passed a comprehensive bipartisan opioid bill in the Senate about 2 weeks ago, 99-1, by the way. We can get things done on a bipartisan basis. We've talked about, we've got a new CBOC, a new health clinic for veterans coming to Portland. We're working on some health options, and the rural economy is showing some real signs of life. So all of those things I'm in the middle of. I don't want to leave. I'm going to keep at it.
Mr. Brakey.
My name is Eric Brakey. I'm the state senator from Auburn who reformed welfare and passed constitutional carry. My family has lived in Maine for 10 generations, and I've represented the people of Androscoggin County for these last 4 years. As Maine people, we're patriots. We love America and the promise of liberty, but the crooked politicians who take advantage of us, we could do without. Angus, you wrote the laws governing the energy industry, requiring Maine people to subsidize select corporations that you then went to work for, taking millions from the Maine people through our taxes and our energy bills, and now you're worth an estimated $22 million. You've been ranked the richest politician in Maine. You know, there's a saying that just because you wear a 3-piece suit doesn't mean you're not a welfare queen. Angus, you may dress down when you visit us up here in Maine, but we all know who paid for your wardrobe. We did. The truth isn't always nice. It isn't always pretty. Sometimes the truth hurts. But, you know, we've had enough silver-tongued politicians telling us nice lies while picking our pockets. Maine people deserve nothing less than the truth, and that's what I intend to deliver today.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to ask questions. We're going to start in order. We'll start with Senator King, and then the next question we'll start with Mr. Brakey. About 2 minutes if you could keep your answers to.
And in case you didn't notice, I have the clock right over here.
Nice,
So
thank you.
keep an eye on it. Absolutely.
Nice.
All right.
Senator, I've been very disturbed about the journalist from Saudi Arabia who got murdered in Turkey. There's a balance between wanting to have good relations with the country in the Middle East, which is our closest friends, recognizing that they are despots in many ways and murderers in many ways. What should we do about that? How do you balance what's best for the United States with what is ethical and moral? How do we do that?
Well, I think, number one, you got to fall back on your values. What are our values? And our values aren't assassinating people on foreign soil, not a citizen of the United States, but a resident of the United States. Something significant happened in Saudi Arabia 2 years ago with a transfer of power. And basically this crown prince, that's his title, but he's really running things. They call him MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has taken over. And he's very young, and he seems to be impulsive. He got Saudi Arabia into this war in Yemen, which is a bad idea, and it's being badly executed by the Saudis, and we're complicit in it, which I don't think is right. I voted against participating in that war. He also picked a fight with one of his neighbors, Qatar, and now this. What really bothers me is the change of stories. Every time we hear, there's a new story about what happened. First, the Saudis said nothing happened. They said he left. Then they said, well, there was a rogue operation. Then they said he picked a fight. None of it really passes a straight-face test. Saudi Arabia is essentially a monarchy. It's a single-person rule, and it doesn't pass any kind of credibility test that this guy, MBS, the Crown Prince, wouldn't have known what went on. It also bothers me how we've been reacting. President Trump's first reaction was, well, they've denied it. And if you remember, he also said, well, Putin denied it, and Kim Jong-un denied it, and I think we've been too ready to accept those things. I think one of the big problems is Congress has to step in and be involved in foreign policy. We've ceded too much power to the president over the years, and I think this is a place, and there are members of Congress, Bob Corker and others, who have said, now's the time for us to step in and reinvigorate American values, to tolerate what went on in the Turkish capital of Istanbul is contrary to our values, and we've got to say this won't go.
Mr. Ringelstein.
So I want to ask Angus King, if we have ceded too much power to the president, why have you voted with the president, Donald Trump, this president? This is not a normal president about half of the time. And why did you vote to confirm Mike Pompeo? I think we have to really consider the full scope of what's going on in Saudi Arabia and the way that we have truly empowered them. We've armed them. There is what appears to be something that's going to be the biggest famine affecting 13 million people in Yemen, and that is because of our arming of Saudi Arabia. Now, Mike Pompeo went ahead and he certified that we are going to continue to back Saudi Arabia. This is a gentleman that Angus King voted to confirm, who goes against all of our best interests. And it's very scary that we are as complicit as we are. The bombs that are literally killing children there are built by Raytheon, a company that Angus King takes corporate PAC money from. You can't tell me that either consciously or unconsciously you're not influenced by that. This is a scary reality. You have a lot of power, Senator King. And I believe that you are using your power, unfortunately, to aid and abet a country that is killing millions, that is literally killing millions of people. This is a very scary situation. And Mike Pompeo is our Secretary of State. You have confirmed him. And you are helping to supply massive amounts of arms to that part of the world. I'd like to see you stand up, be bold, take a moral global stance, and promote some peace.
Mr. Brakey.
You know, I agree with Senator King when he says that the executive branch has too much authority. The difference is that Senator King voted to give the executive branch a lot of that authority when President Obama was in the White House. This is the problem when we have our principles change depending whether a Republican or a Democrat is in charge. You know, but let's be clear about one thing. Saudi Arabia is not our friend. In fact, I helped lead the national push to declassify 28 pages of the 9/11 report that showed clear links between high-ranking officials in the Saudi government and the attacks of September 11th. Now 9/11 families are suing the Saudi government for the role they played. And yet, under the Obama administration, Angus King actually voted to send weapons to the Saudi government, which have been used to kill school children and bomb weddings in Yemen while the war in Yemen was going on. You know, and I have the vote on that right here. Some of the things that he voted to send $1.15 billion in U.S. arms to the Saudis. That includes 153 Abrams tanks, 153 50 caliber machine guns, 266 M240 machine guns, and on. Over $1 billion in weapons to the Saudi government that Senator King voted for while this war in Yemen was going on. He can say that he opposes it now, but he voted for it then under Barack Obama. And he's also endorsed the foreign policy that started a war in Libya, led to the murder of our ambassadors and Marines in Benghazi, and destabilized the region, leading to the emergence of open-air human slave markets and the creation of ISIS. Now Angus actually has the gall to call last year on CNN for impeachment proceedings on the president, supporting partisan radicals accusing President Trump of treason for engaging in diplomacy with Russia. Meanwhile, Angus King actually voted to send weapons to radical groups in the Middle East. Some radical groups allied with ISIS and al-Qaeda, the people who actually attacked us and murdered 3,000 Americans. Now, I don't know what sounds more treasonous, seeking peace with Russia or sending weapons to al-Qaeda. But Angus is so focused on getting us to fear Russia and forget our true enemies that on the anniversary of 9/11 at a commemoration event, he even said that Russian hacking was the same kind of attack on America as the falling of the Twin Towers. Angus, I think this is incredibly grossly out of touch. You've been fear-mongering on Russia to get us forget our real enemies in the Middle East as you send weapons to them. But we'll never forget.
We are talking to our U.S. Senate candidates. We have all three here with us right now. They're joining us for a special forum on the U.S. Senate race. And next up on this one...
do we want to allow anybody to give it a response?
We can certainly do that. We didn't plan that originally.
But I think giving everybody 30 seconds to just briefly respond.
That's fine. Yeah, if you're directly referenced, I think we can do that. Sure. Okay, Senator King, you were referenced a number of times. So
yes, I don't think 30 seconds will quite do it. I don't quite know where to start.
You only have 30 seconds.
Libya, I wasn't in office. I had nothing to do with the policy in Libya. I did vote at one point for arms to Saudi Arabia, which is a long, like a 50-year policy. That was before Mohammed bin Salman took over. I voted against allowing our arms to be used in Yemen. I did not equate Russian hacking to September 11th. I equated a cyber attack on our critical infrastructure, which would be incredibly destructive. I said this is something that we have to fear as well as terrorist attacks. I voted to allow September 11 victims to sue the Saudis. Voted twice, as I said, on Yemen. I did vote to approve Mr. Pompeo. I knew him. He is not who I would have chosen, but I felt he would be a voice of restraint on foreign policy in the president's office. You've got to make those choices. There's no way to vote, on something like that. So I don't, like I say, it's hard to know where to start coming from both of these guys, but those are the things
that is a good place to start.
Well, and let's give you want a chance, Mr. Finkelstein, you want a chance.
Yeah, I think I want to have a facts-based discussion. I think if there's anything missing from the dialogue in politics right now, it's that we are unfortunately losing our ability to focus on facts. And the reality is that we have a very serious situation in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and the reality is, quite frankly, Eric, you are a little bombastic with your comments against Angus. I don't appreciate the way that you say that Angus wants Syrians as opposed to your kids to have a good future here in Maine. I actually find that to be rather offensive to the political discourse. But I will say that we need to focus on the facts about Angus King. And as he mentioned, he voted for arms. He voted for Mike Pompeo. He has effectively given a lot of power to MBS, who he describes, And I would like to see some bold leadership in this time. Where is moral, bold leadership? We need more in this election. This is 2018. This is a crisis. We need something better.
All right, let's leave it there and move on to the next questions, if you don't mind.
I think both of them have had a chance to speak in the aftermath of that, and I haven't had a chance to speak.
Well, the only reference that was made was Zach just referencing you a moment ago, as far as I understand, with an attack. I mean, I think we could go round and round on this quite a bit, but I'd like to go to the questions if that's all right. We have been rather flexible with the clock already, so. To stay on foreign policy briefly, this kind of dovetails into domestic policy, I think, in a lot of ways. But we've seen with President Trump coming into office that the way the United States has been dealing with foreign partners has changed. Whether it's NAFTA, whether it's tariffs, whether it's just recently we saw today the threat of pulling out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty and maybe even New START as well. So the relationship between the United States and foreign powers is different today. Senator Brakey, you are first up for this question. So I guess my question to you is, do you find what you have seen in the last couple of years to be the right approach in this regard? Should we be more confrontational with allies? Should we be looking for pressure points with tariffs to try to negotiate new trade deals, or is that a mistake in your opinion?
We need to have an America First foreign policy where we recognize that our men and women in uniform signed up to defend our country, to defend our Constitution, to defend our people and our freedoms, not to be deployed across the world and misused by politicians in Washington, D.C. as this global United Nations police force, which is what, sadly, they have been used for many times. But I do want to say one thing in response. Senator Angus, you said that you had nothing to do with the war in Libya, that it happened before you were in office. That's true. But you specifically, when you endorsed Hillary Clinton for president, you specifically cited her foreign policy as the primary reason for endorsing her. And Libya was the seminal moment of her foreign policy as Secretary of State. So if it wasn't Libya that you were...
her foreign policy, I cited her temperament in a helicopter at a time of nuclear crisis as someone I would rather have making that decision than Mr. Trump. That was what that article said.
Let's keep this to a structured response.
Well, we can go back to it, but foreign policy is what you specifically mentioned. And if it wasn't that, I don't know if it was her wanting to shoot Russian airplanes out of the sky over Syria that attracted you to it. But, President Trump, for all his faults, has been advocating for an America First foreign policy, for making sure that when we deploy our military, we're doing it in America's interest, that we are engaging diplomatically, sometimes with tough diplomacy, with nations like Russia and North Korea. And I think that the foreign policy accomplishments we've seen over these last 2 years have been astounding. From North Korea coming to the table and peace being brokered for the first time in a half century. And if anyone is skeptical about what's going on over there, I think the only people we need to ask are the South Koreans, who have a lot at stake and are thanking President Trump for what he's done over there. As far as trade deals, President Trump has played tough on trade, but it's been playing out and it's been working out well. We've got new trade deals with Canada, new trade deals with Mexico, new trade deals with the European Union. There's still work to do. I want to see a new trade deal with China so we can finally get fair trade and stop being taken advantage of.
Mr. Finkelstein.
We need to focus here on our own people. I find it very destructive that we are spending about $1 trillion on our war budget, which both of our U.S. senators, quite frankly, voted to pass. We added $82 billion to our war budget this year. For that amount of money, there are so many things we could be doing to our public schools. Specifically, we could have tuition-free public colleges and universities. So I want to focus on our country investing in the working class and making sure that everybody has access to healthcare, that we have high-speed broadband here in America, that we are paying our public school teachers more. If you look around the world, you can see examples of people taking care of their own people. For example, other places that have single-payer healthcare. And we need to be a model of human rights right here in this country. As you guys probably all know, I went down to the border when there was a human rights crisis because of the Trump administration and some of these egregious policies and actually Eric gave me $100 for that. trip to help pay for books, supplies, and what we were trying to deliver to children there. And what I'll say about this is that we need to start focusing right here at home on making sure that America truly is taking care of its own people through healthcare, education, infrastructure, and making sure that we have a healthy and clean environment.
Mr. Ringelstein, but my question was about specifically tariffs and whether or not that's the right approach internationally to handle this type of a question. Do you think that, because this is something that is in many ways crossing partisan boundaries, you have people like Bernie Sanders agreeing with President Trump on tariffs sometimes, and then you have, I think, the right and the left in different wings of the parties also saying that free trade is better and that we shouldn't be going about this way.
Sure.
Where do you stand on that?
Sure. So I have said many times that our international trade agreements, because they've been written for multinational corporations to benefit the big companies and not working people here in Maine, that they are incredibly problematic and they need to be rewritten for the working people. Free trade is inevitable and we need to have free trade, but we cannot have free trade that benefits multinationals as opposed to, for example, loggers here in this state that are benefiting multinationals but not making sure that our fishermen on the coast are getting what they need. And so there is a problem that I believe that Democrats and Republicans can all agree on if big money is not in control of these trade agreements.
Okay. And Senator King, I'll allot you an extra 30 seconds because Eric referenced you in the previous comment. So.
But I haven't answered your question yet.
Start there, and then if you'd like to readdress him,
no, that's all right. I'll just jump into the answer.
Sure.
I opposed NAFTA in 1994. I didn't think it was fair to the U.S. I didn't think it was negotiated well on our behalf. And so this is an area where I have agreed with the president, at least in his concept, of trying to negotiate fairer agreements that were safer and better, particularly for American working people and for the people of the country. So the problem I have with the method that they're going about is how they're doing it. It's a kind of it's with a sledgehammer instead of with a scalpel. And the other piece that I'm concerned about is taking on our allies, whether it's the EU or Canada or Mexico, when the real object of our trade imbalance should be China. And we're going to need a united front with China, and alienating the allies makes it harder to confront China on trade. There are definitely issues, particularly the theft of intellectual property, where China is taking advantage of us, and I think we need to fix that. In terms of the president's diplomacy generally, listen, I think if we can find a diplomatic solution in North Korea, I will be the first person to say hooray and congratulations to the president. My concern is this is the 5th time we've been here since 1993. We've had 5 different negotiations with the North Koreans where we've made concessions. They've promised to denuclearize. They never do it. And my worry is that the president is so invested in this now that if and when they pull the rug out, he could be provoked to do something that I think would be very dangerous. So if he can pull that off, you know, that would be great. As far as America First is concerned, we can't disengage from the world. Whether we like it or not, we're one of the world's great powers, and we have to play a role in setting the norms and making the world system safe, not by sending troops, but by continuing to invest in alliances and the people that we've successfully worked with for some 70 years.
We are doing a debate of the senatorial candidates, the U.S. Senate seat coming up to election. We have Rick Brakey from the Republican Party, and we have Zach Ringelstein from the Democratic Party, and of course, independent Angus King, current senator. I think Mr. Ringelstein has the first question, all right? I think that's what
I believe so, because we started
take
with
right.
last time.
Okay,
Great.
So we have a caravan approaching, again, second caravan coming up through Mexico. If you were a senator of the United States of America, what would you do with the immigration policy? What would you do with the caravan? What would your solution be?
First of all, we do not need to build a wall. Period. Second of all, we need to stop the fear-mongering. The fear-mongering is over the top. Immigrants in this country are what this country is made of. I'm a descendant of immigrants. for the most part, all of us are, unless someone out there is indigenous. And we need to make sure that we are honoring what we're built from and what we're built out of. And what Trump is doing at the border is a human rights violation that, quite frankly, we would have gone to war with other countries for. We are caging children. We are separating kids from their families, which we know is going to create trauma and stress and hurt these children's development for the rest of their lives. And what I think we need to do is we need to, A, as I mentioned, not build a wall. B, we need to end deportations. C, we need to make sure that all dreamers have a pathway to citizenship. And we need to remember that the kids that I taught in the schools right here in Portland, that these families are coming here to live the American dream, and that these are folks who are adding to our economy in immense ways and are going to be part of this American story, and we need to accept our immigrants with open arms. And especially here in Maine, where we are seeing, actually in the 2nd Congressional District, we're seeing a depression that is longer and deeper than the Great Depression. And one of the things we can do, and I'm gonna, I really don't want to hear the fear-mongering around this. We know that when immigrants come to various parts of the country, they boost our economy. And what we need to do is we need to invite more people from across the country and across the world to Maine, and we need to grow our economy, and that's a surefire way of doing so.
Senator.
King.
Well, I think the first thing is that we need to, as I think I mentioned before, one way to answer all these questions is to come back to our basic values. Who are we as a people? And one of our basic values is not separating families, not putting children in cages, not treating people in inhumane ways. That's number one. I think that has to be a policy. Number two, we have to have borders, and we do have to have border security, but it should be smart border security. There are places where a wall makes sense. In fact, there are places where there already is a wall. I've seen it in McAllen, Texas. But there are many places where it doesn't make sense, and it just doesn't contribute to our national security. It's incredibly expensive and would be harmful to our country and to our country's a view of our country around the world. I think there's an aspect of this that nobody's talking about, which is we need to figure out why are these people coming. And by the way, they're not coming from Mexico. Illegal immigration from Mexico has been reduced practically to zero. These people are coming from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala in Central America, and they're coming because their countries have essentially collapsed. They're dangerous. They are breeding grounds of crime, poverty. They're taking incredible risks to try to escape to a better life, which is what everyone who's come to this country for the past 200 years, other than the African Americans who were brought here involuntarily, has done. We've got to try to help rebuild those countries. Mexico's economy has improved. That's why people aren't coming across the border from Mexico. We need to help improve the economies and the lives in those three countries in Central America, so that we don't have to deal with people coming to this country to escape. We can do, I think, those things and perhaps take some of the money that would otherwise go to a wall and use it to improve the lot of those who feel that they have to escape to the United States. Let them stay in their own country. I think that's a solution that would work for everyone.
Ms. Brakey.
So I'm the only candidate in this race who supports secure borders. Actually, in his zeal to score political points against the president, Angus here actually co-sponsored a bill that would have given all legal immigrants a free pass, provided they had a kid with them, even not verifying whether or not that kid was kidnapped on the other side of the border and just brought along in order to get that free pass. Now, it's just obvious that you can't have open borders in a welfare state. A Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman once said that. But that's what politicians today are trying to force on us. As an already poor state, we already stretch our social safety net resources very thin, trying to care for our most vulnerable, including our seniors and our truly disabled. But our already strained safety net is falling apart under the added weight of foreign peoples, including many here illegally, being dumped on our welfare rolls by D.C. politicians. You know, Angus said earlier this year that he wants even more immigration to Maine from places like Somalia and Syria to solve our workforce shortage. Of course, he helped create this workforce shortage when he left the state of Maine $1 billion in debt, nearly bankrupted our hospitals, and drove many of our jobs away, turning our kids into economic refugees forced to flee Maine for opportunity in other states. You know, frankly, that's the refugee crisis I care about. Our kids are still leaving Maine. You know, I was just at the University of Maine in Farmington talking to college seniors, and every single one I spoke to told me about the plans they have to leave. That's where they're looking for jobs in other states. But I talked to those Maine people who've actually moved away, and almost every single one of them, in the back of their mind, they want to come back to Maine. They want to be here. We just need to have the better jobs to make Maine the kind of place where our kids can stay and our kids can return home. So that's going to be my number one priority in the U.S. Senate representing Maine, working to create those better jobs by getting Washington out of our way so we can finally end Maine's refugee crisis and bring our kids home.
All right, Senator, do you want 30 seconds to respond to what Mr. Brakey said about...
Well, I don't know what he's talking about a free pass. I voted for the most comprehensive border security provision, I think, ever before the Congress in 2013, which was part of the comprehensive immigration reform sponsored principally by Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee. Also, in terms of jobs, during the 8 years that I was governor, the state added an average of about 10,000 jobs a year during that period. I don't think that number has been exceeded since. I haven't checked, but certainly the economy has got to be a huge problem. And the final piece is workforce. You cannot talk to an employer in Maine who doesn't tell you that their biggest problem is qualified workers, whether it's in southern Maine, eastern or northern Maine, and we've got to have the workers, and whether they come from New Jersey or Iowa or Maine or Ireland, I think we've got to have the workforce or our economy is going to stall.
All right, let me stop you there, Senator. We are talking to our U.S. Senate candidates. All three are joining us here. I believe, Senator King, you are next up on the next question, which turns to domestic policy. One of the only major pieces of legislation that was passed in the first year of the Trump administration was, of course, the tax cut bill, which not only made changes to the personal income tax, but also to the corporate income tax. Obviously, we know what your vote was on that, but I'd love to hear your perspective on the wisdom or lack thereof of what you saw happen in Congress at the time, and what you'd like to do going forward now that it has passed, if you have an opportunity in the next couple of years to make continual revisions to the tax code.
Well, first, let's be clear. I voted no. Secondly, I believe that our tax code did need reform, and a group of us met with the White House and with some Republican leaders early in that process and said, we'd like to be involved, we'd like to make a contribution. We think there are places where the tax code can be improved. Our corporate tax rate is the highest in the world, should be reduced. We were basically stiff-armed, and as you know, the bill went through on a flat party line vote entirely in both houses. And my problem was, I don't think it was really a tax cut. What it really was borrowing from our kids. It's not a tax cut if you're already in a deficit situation and you have to borrow to fill the hole. That's just a shift of the taxes to our kids. And that's exactly what this bill did. It added something like $1.9 trillion to the deficit, and we passed it at a time when the economy was already close to full employment. There's been some improvement in the economy, which isn't unexpected when you dump that much money in at one time. But the other problem with the tax bill was, and this has been proven out, the benefits went vastly disproportionately to the very top income people. Something like 80% of the benefits went to the top 1%. And that just doesn't make sense. The cuts for the wealthy were permanent. The cuts for the middle class were temporary. The benefits went disproportionately to the wealthy, and corporations have spent much more of their windfall from the tax cuts on stock buybacks, which benefit their stockholders and their executives, than they have on raising pay. Pay is essentially flat. We were promised pay was going to go up, revenues were going to go up. None of those things have happened. We're headed for the worst deficit in, I think, the last 8 or 9 years in the year to come, principally because of what I think was an ill-considered tax cut. We could have had one that made sense. We could have had one that was fair. It wasn't done that way, and that's why I voted no.
Senator Brakey, I suspect there might be a difference opinion here. Why don't you go ahead?
Certainly. Well, I think that the proof is right before us. I mean, we have the lowest unemployment rate in this country in the last 50 years. Now, we have more jobs. We certainly still need better jobs, but we are on the right track, and these tax cuts were a big part of that. Now, Senator King, I certainly am sympathetic when you talk about the debt and the deficit. In fact, that's a very big issue for me. It's one of the reasons I got involved, as a young person, realizing that these now $21 trillion in debt is going to be falling on the shoulders of my generation and those that follow. But I wish I'd heard the same rhetoric from you when you were voting to add $5 trillion in new debt through spending to that debt. Nonpartisan groups have ranked you among the biggest spenders in Washington, D.C. There's not a single spending bill you've ever voted against. Republicans always want to spend more on overseas spending. Democrats always want to spend more on welfare spending. And Angus, you always bring people together and say, I have an idea, let's just spend more on everything and then we'll all be happy. But then we end up getting stuck with the bills, the American people, the people of Maine. We're $21 trillion in debt now. We have $113 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That's a bill of over $1.1 million for every single American taxpayer. We need to have Washington, D.C. and the special interests that feed at the taxpayer trough there. We've got to fight back against this looting of the American people. It has gotten increasingly worse as time has gone on. And, and frankly, I don't see letting American people keep more of the money that they earn. I don't see that as spending. I see that as letting us keep more of the money that we earn. We need to cut spending. Places we can do that. We can look at some of the overseas spending. We spend trillions of dollars on these wars, like the war in Afghanistan that's gone on now for 17 years. And as far as I can tell, Osama bin Laden's been dead for quite a while. It's time to bring our troops home. It's time to celebrate their victory and throw them a parade. It's time to take the money we're spending overseas and reinvesting in infrastructure here at home. There's a lot that we can do, but it requires that we put America first.
All right, Senator King, I will give you a moment in a second to respond, but let's see if Zach wants to attack you first.
I don't actually. Actually, I'm actually happy to hear Angus talk a little bit about the rigged economy. I haven't heard you talk about that enough, and I'd like to hear you talk about that. And I'd like to see you act on that more, because we do live in a rigged economy where 1% of our country owns almost half of all of our wealth, where about half of our country can't afford a $400 emergency, where 1 in 5 children are growing up in poverty in the richest country on earth. And then we go ahead and we give a $1.9 trillion tax break to the ultra wealthy. That is ridiculous. It is the opposite of rational. It is irrational government, and it is scary. And what I want to say is that with $1.9 trillion, think about all the wonderful things we could do. Think about the opportunity to raise teacher salaries. I proposed a policy in Forbes magazine a few weeks ago to raise teacher salaries to a federal minimum of $60,000 a year. And do you know that we could literally fund this for 10 years for every single teacher in America for the amount that this tax bill cost? I want to reinvest in the people of this state. We need bold leadership right now if we think that the people are going to have anything other than scraps. And right now, our wages aren't growing. People are having to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. And meanwhile, I'm hearing stories of single mothers who have worked hard their entire lives with children who are crying in grocery stores because they're realizing that they can't pay for food on the table. This is not American. We need better than this. And quite frankly, this tax bill is one of the saddest things that's happened in American policy.
Senator King, would you like your 30 seconds? Okay.
All right, so we have the 3 candidates of the Senate in the studio with a spirited debate. I lost track who's next. I think Ms. Brakey.
We started with Senator King, so it'd be Mr. Brakey.
We just went through one of the most tumultuous Supreme Court nominations in certainly recent memory since Clarence Thomas and perhaps Judge Bork. It's possible we'll have another Supreme Court nominee in the next 2 years if, unfortunately, Judge Ginsburg or one of the other judges passes away. What do you view as what your policy as a senator would be if you were senator with the next Supreme Court nomination?
Well, thank you. I want judges who understand what their job is. to interpret the law, to apply the law, not to legislate from the bench and write the laws. And frankly, that's one of the biggest places that I object with Senator King on his objection to Judge Kavanaugh. You know, he said that Judge Kavanaugh was not qualified because he was on a name on a list from a group called the Federalist Society, which he described as having a radical ideology. Their radical ideology is that they believe the Constitution means what it says. You know, the Constitution it's the contract that we the people have with our government. If we allow the government to say, well, it's just this living document that we can reinterpret to mean whatever we want it to mean, then there's no contract there. Imagine if you had a contract with an employer to work for $20 an hour, and when you finish the job, your employer comes back and says, well, it's a living document, and, you know, actually I interpret that as $10 an hour. We wouldn't accept that. But that's exactly what Washington, D.C. is doing with our Constitution. And I want to, you know, hit back on one thing. You know, Angus, you said that you've opposed NAFTA, but in 1996, you voiced strong support for NAFTA. In fact, you blasted critics who said that the agreement would cost American jobs. Now, I appreciate that perhaps you've changed your mind on this, but we've seen this a lot. It seems like you flip and you flop from issue to issue depending on which way the wind's blowing. And we need a senator who's going to have some consistency, that their policies aren't going to change based on political expedience. It's not going to change depending on who's in the White House, but a senator who's going to stand for the rights, the liberties of Maine people, no matter what the circumstances.
You're next.
Sure. So I think there are a lot of people out there who are devastated that Kavanaugh has a lifelong appointment to the Supreme Court. I went on a bus with activists down to Washington, D.C., many of whom were survivors of sexual assault. And what I experienced was a lot of political games. Unfortunately, from our own Susan Collins, who Angus King endorsed. And listen, Angus voted the right way on this. Senator, I appreciate you voting the right way on this. I would like for you, again, to start taking some bold leadership stances. We heard very little from you in terms of bold leadership, in terms of pushing the narrative forward that having Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court really is the corporatization of what is supposed to be our independent judiciary. I didn't hear much about from you about, unfortunately, just taking a bold stance against your colleague, Senator Susan Collins, who you went ahead and endorsed. And what we need from you is bold leadership on these issues. And you know, right now in 2018, with Trump as our president, in the global crisis we're in, having an anti-environment, anti-LGBTQ, anti-worker Supreme Court justice now in the highest courts in the land, it would be nice to hear from one of our U.S. senators what's really happening. And instead of being taken all the way to the far right, what if somebody were actually putting on the brakes for us? And what if instead of just voting no, Angus King were more like some of our other great senators like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who were actually trying to make a point and were actually spending their nights trying to convince someone like Susan Collins to say no. You could have saved us, and we would have liked to have seen that.
Senator King, since they both referenced you, some extra time for you as well.
Well, let's talk about Judge Kavanaugh. First, I announced my opposition to Judge Kavanaugh before any of the allegations about sexual assault came to light. And I announced them very strongly in a speech I would refer you on the Senate floor up to and including the night before his confirmation vote. It's a lifetime job, and it seems to me that requires a very high standard. There are no do-overs, there are no second chances. I had a lot of problems with his nomination, the first of which was we only saw 10% of his work product. It was the 90% of what he said and wrote when he worked in the Bush White House was kept back. If this radio station had a job applicant and said, I'm only going to show you 10% of what I've done in the past, and by the way, an old buddy of mine is going to decide which 10%, and by the way, once you hire me, you can never fire me, you'd laugh at him. I mean, that's just a ridiculous process. But I also, on a deeper level, oppose Judge Kavanaugh because I believe he will, and we're all going to know the answer to this within a couple of years. He's going to vote against environmental protection. He's going to vote against health care for people. He's going to vote to gut Roe versus Wade. And I think he's going to make a series of votes based upon his record that will be inimical to the people of Maine. Another piece that really bothered me was he stated a very broad view of what the presidential power was, that the president, he thought, should not be subject to investigation, let alone indictment or subpoena. That's a legitimate, you can argue that point of view, but once he said that, I felt he should have recused himself from any votes that involved the president who appointed him. And finally, he looked at the committee that day in that memorable hearing and said, what goes around comes around. That's a threat, and nobody should be on a court who makes a threat to anybody in this country. I used to appoint judges as governor of the state of Maine. If anyone in an interview had said something like that, they would have been immediately disqualified. So I felt that there were other conservative judges that the president could have named. I understand he's going to name conservative judges, but I just think Brett Kavanaugh was not the right person. We are going to learn over the next 2 or 3 years who was right on that. And I did talk to my colleague Susan Collins. She made her own decision. She did her homework and arrived at a different conclusion. We disagreed. But as I say, I think we're going to see what happens. I think it was a very unfortunate circumstance, and I hope I'm wrong about his record as a judge, but I'm afraid he's going to be not a positive member of the United States.
Zach, I know you want to say something, but we only have time for closing. So can you do it within the context of your closing?
Sure.
Since you get to go first.
You do get to go
We'll
first.
give you 15 extra seconds.
Well, actually,
All right, give me 50. Yeah.
So we don't have time for another question, but we are going to get out at 59:30, so we do have a little bit of extra time. So why don't we bump you guys all up to 2 minutes?
Why don't we say 1 minute and 15, then let them go back.
That's not a bad idea.
Okay, so go. Thank you.
All right.
Use your brevity.
All right. Well, I just want to say that we need a U.S. Senator who is standing up for the American people in a time of crisis. And what Senator King said is classic Senator King. He is riding the fence, not taking any bold positions on, quite frankly, anything, and just going with the winds. And what we need, we know how politics works. We know who the reliable votes were going to be, and we need someone who is actually going to say, Susan, this is a life or death decision for Americans. Susan Collins, this is about whether or not Trump might take over this country and decide in a few years that he wants to end term limits. This is about Roe v. Wade and it going down in flames. This is way bigger than just a vote. And what we need from you, Senator King, is bold leadership. We need you to stop introducing gas pipeline bills to the U.S. Senate. We need you to stop taking money from pharmaceutical companies. We need Medicare for all. We need 100% renewable energy. We need to make sure that tax cuts aren't going to the stockholder class, that you're not co-sponsoring bills to deregulate Wall Street, but that we're actually standing up for working people who, by the way, whose dollars are being taxed more than the ultra wealthy in this country. As children across this country are living in poverty and families can't make ends meet, we're going to continue on this path. What have you done for us, Senator King? Your voice of reason standing in the middle is not enough in 2018. As you stand in the middle, the country goes farther and farther corporate, and what we need is bold leadership. Someone who is going to stand up for healthcare, human rights,
we need to move on to Senator King.
and renewable energy.
There's a real question about how you get things done. And the truth is, you get things done by listening, and you get things done by working with people who may not agree with you. And I look back, I was thinking last night, what have we gotten done? Later this week, or I think early next week, I'm going to be at New Balance in Norridgewock, celebrating a government contract for the military for 200,000 pairs of shoes that's going to keep people working in Norridgewock and Skowhegan. That got done because of work that I did on the Armed Services Committee over the objections of John McCain, where I worked with Republican colleagues, got the votes, passed the amendment that allowed the New Balance contract to go forward. That wouldn't have happened if it had been all one side. We had to have votes from both sides. In 2013, I led the brokering of a student loan compromise that saved student loan interest rates from doubling. They would have gone to 6.8%. They tell me that the calculation is since that bill passed in the summer of 2013, it saved American students $50 billion in interest payments, $250 million here in Maine. Just in the opioid bill passed just 2 weeks ago, I lobbied and got a nurse practitioners section in that allows nurse practitioners and physician's assistants to administer medication-assisted treatment, a huge benefit to rural Maine. I saw a nurse practitioner over the weekend who said that's one of the most important provisions of the bill. I worked, believe it or not, it took an act of Congress to get a new veterans clinic in southern Maine, a large one that's going to come forward over the next 2 years. So all of these things were accomplished by working with people, listening to people, and that's the only way we can get things done.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Senator.
Yeah, 1 minute.
So we do have to get things done, and I'm proud that I have a record in the Maine Senate of getting things done. While Angus King was voting 93% of the time with Chuck Schumer, telling us all he's an independent, I have worked with Republicans and Democrats in the Maine legislature to pass welfare reform, to pass constitutional carry, to expand access and choice in health care. I've been called one of the most effective legislators in the Maine Senate. The first year that I was there, even the Portland Press-Herald called me the Rookie of the Year. But you know what? I want to, in this closing moment, I just want to talk about the real problem that we face. You know, oftentimes the left blames big corporations for the problems that we have, and the right blames big government for the problems that we have. But the truth is they're both right. It's the revolving door of corporate and government power. And Senator King, you made your first $8 million in a contract with Central Maine Power, while you were in fact dating the top lobbyist for Central Maine Power. As governor, you made it your priority to force our already poor state to subsidize corporations that blow off the top of our mountains and drive up our energy bills. Then after leaving us $1 billion in debt with these handouts to special interests, you cashed in and went to work for these companies and lobbied the Obama administration for millions in taxpayer-financed sweetheart loans.
Yeah, 10 seconds and it's going to
all right, can you really not see a conflict of interest in this arrangement? Because I think that we all can.
Our debate of the Senator. Ken, thank you all.
Thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you.